Will tax cuts be a vote winner? How do we get the unemployed back to work? And should children skip school to protest? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Kit Malthouse, Labour's Dame Angela Eagle, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas, and Associate Editor at The Telegraph, Camilla Tominey. Today,
it will take discipline and we need to prioritise. But over time, we can and we will cut taxes.
With rumours swirling ahead of the Chancellor's statement tomorrow, could tax cuts sweeten the deal with voters at the next election?
Fairness is also about being fair to the person who leaves home every morning to go out to work and sees their neighbour still asleep living a life on benefits.
That was 11 years ago. Will tomorrow's autumn statement see a return to the strivers versus shirkers debate?
The report shows that the emissions gap is more like an emissions canyon. A canyon littered with broken promises, broken lives and broken records.
As the impact of climate change is felt across the world, can we stop a 3-degree rise in temperatures? And as pro-Palestinian protests continue, should children skip school to take part? In case you've missed it, the Chancellor is going to deliver his autumn statement tomorrow, and we will have a special Politics Live programme kicking off at 11:15. We'll cover, of course, Prime Minister's questions and then the statement straight afterwards from the Chancellor and the response from Labour. It looks as if some sort of cut in personal taxation is on the cards. There's certainly been a lot of kite flying. Let's have a look at this front page of the Daily Mail. Return of tax cutting Tories, and the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole, thinks he knows which taxes might be cut specifically. He is saying it could be an expected cut to national insurance. He says Laura Trott, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, let that slip. There's also been sustained pressure from the right of the Conservative Party for tax cuts. But my question, starting with you, Kit, is are they actually a vote winner?
Oh, I definitely think they are. Yes, absolutely.
Based on what?
Look, I've been advocating tax cuts both within Cabinet since November 21 and outside because I think people recognise that the tax burden has got too high. They want to have more of their own income to spend themselves on the things that are important to them. But fundamentally, I believe in the economic power of tax cuts, that if we're going to have an economy that grows, we can't have one where the public sector is swallowing too much of the private sector, and we need to rebalance it. For me, tomorrow I'll be looking for a couple of things. I mean, I'm hoping there will be some kind of tax cut that is stimulating to the economy, because I think the Bank of England has overcorrected and we're going to be in trouble if we don't do something. But secondly, it's not just about the individual tax cuts, it's about the tax burden as well.
Well,
so
the overall burden,
the overall tax burden, give and take.
Well, right? you've answered more questions than I asked, but thank you, thank you for that in terms of the order. No, well, that was very generous of you. Do you think they're a vote winner, Angela? I haven't heard the evidence necessarily they're a vote winner. That's certainly Kit's opinion.
Well, look, I think that if you look at this Parliament, it's the biggest tax-raising Parliament
on record,
probably in our history, and certainly since records began. £4,000 per household in tax increases since 2019. So if there's a tiny little tweak of a tax cut right at the end of this Parliament, which doesn't impact on that in very many ways, it won't make much difference, because what have they got for it? People are worse off. Public services are crumbling and falling down. There's sewage in our rivers. Nothing seems to work. The public transport system's awful. So people are not only paying the highest taxes since for 70 years, we've got the lowest growth since the 1920s, and real wages are more stagnant than they've been since Napoleonic times.
So I
don't think it's a brilliant overall picture.
Right, you don't think it's a vote winner?
It will not rescue the Tories.
Right.
What do you go further, actually, would you?
Well,
the bigger tax cuts might.
This is the thing. People need to get the state working so that their cost of living crisis is eased, and that is not happening. We're in the middle of the biggest stealth tax rises because of the freeze in tax thresholds, bringing in an estimated
50 billion.
54 billion
By the end.
and by the end, which is 6 years' time. So if you taking that amount of money off people and then you give them a tiny little change or tweak to national insurance or income tax,
Because do you think
it's not
Labour
going to
would-
make a difference in
but
the
Angela,
overall
I'm really
scheme of
intrigued to the
things.
answer to the question, because I've asked a lot of different Labour
About it being a
shadow
vote
ministers.
winner?
Well, no, just about whether they would cut tax, because you're saying this. So are you saying that you think that you would unfreeze tax bands?
Well, let me put another.
Well,
yeah, you can, and let me just put the other side of this,
come on, we
because
want an answer.
we'll come back. We'll come back.
I was on the radio with Emily Thornberry. She
Kit,
wouldn't answer the question either on Sunday night. Come on, Angela.
We'll come back. We'll come back to Angela in just a moment. But what I want to ask is if there is any extra room or any extra amount for the government to use in this autumn statement, is cutting taxes going to win people round, or would they rather it was spent on public services?
Well, I suspect the latter. As you say, I haven't seen the evidence one way or the other, but I do know that people are feeling absolutely desperate in terms of not being able to get appointments at the NHS, in terms of the level of those waiting lists, in terms of people being on food banks. We are at a really, really desperate state for a huge number of people right now. So if we're going to talk about tax, the tax I would like to talk about is the tax on the richest and the tax on wealth, because it does strike me to be quite a thing that here in this country, we massively undertax wealth compared to income. So over the last 10 years, I think the average tax on income has been about 32%, the average tax on wealth has been about 4%. So why don't we start making sure that those people with the biggest shoulders, who are getting all of that unearned income from their dividends and from their stocks and shares, why don't we start taxing that? Because I think the big question is, who is paying that tax? I think the richest should be paying more so we can properly invest in our public services.
Is it a vote winner to cut taxes?
I think so, when the tax burden's at a historic high and they've received so much negative publicity about it, and because the polling suggests that people are now regarding Labour as the party of economic competence, notwithstanding the fact that Labour won't say whether they will reduce tax or indeed spending.
Let's ask you, will you reduce the overall tax burden if you win the election?
Well, look, I mean, it's for our Shadow Chancellor to make those calls, and
But would
she
you
will
like to see that?
will reply to the autumn statement tomorrow and give her view on what we would do. No opposition ever has a budget when it hasn't seen the overall figures, when it's not been in the Treasury to look. But Rachel has been quite clear. One of the problems we have and the stagnating growth we've got, the Bank of England think there's a 50% chance that we may be in recession next year, and the economy is bumbling along with zero growth. We need to do something about our appalling investment issues, which is why we've talked about our Green New Deal. We've got to transform our infrastructure.
Although you're delaying that, aren't you?
Well, you can't spend it all at once from a standing start. You've got to do it in a way which doesn't waste money. But we know that with the Inflation Reduction Act in America, with the EU's response to it, we have to decarbonise our entire structures and systems, and now is the time to do it.
All right, let's have a look at one of the things that we are expecting to be announced tomorrow in the Times. Working from home push to get more sick Britons off benefits. And these are plans to get more benefit claimants into work, saying the report says sick Britons will be told to find jobs where they can work from home. Starting with you, Kit, going off your government's figures, there are 2.6 million people in the UK who can't work due to long-term sickness or disability. How many of those people, in your mind, don't actually want to work?
Oh, God, I've absolutely no idea. How would I know?
Right.
But the point is...
Well, if you don't know...
Hold on a minute, Joe. The point is there's no problem, presumably, in asking or trying to work out.
Haven't you done that already?
Well, we're trying. I mean, a lot of these people came through post-pandemic, right? The number of people who've remained economically inactive post-pandemic has been much larger than it was going into the pandemic. But the point is, in every kind of situation, whether it's a disability, the state assesses the suitability of the person for benefits.
So they've not been working?
Tries to help them and support them into work.
All right.
But to be honest with you, I don't understand what the problem is. I mean, lots of people who are sick or ill or disabled would love to work.
Yeah.
They just need to have the right
But your
accommodations and
focus is
support
on
to do
those who
so.
actually don't want to. So I'm just interested in your view as to whether you think this is a massive problem of those 2.6 million people, or whether it is due to perhaps not getting hospital treatment or appointments, or whether you feel that a more punitive regime will actually unlock a large number of those people back into work.
Well, I definitely think that we've learned from the welfare system over the last 10 years or so that quite a lot of carrot through universal credit, but a bit of stick as well, does get us to a situation where we have employment at record highs, right? Where lots and lots of people who were either they were trapped in the welfare system or didn't have the right incentive or support
We also
structure.
have people who simply
Hold on a
cannot
minute,
earn enough
weren't
to-
able
Well,
to
hang
get,
on,
weren't
hang
able
on.
to get onto work.
Yeah,
so
but-
I don't see what the problem
All right,
is.
well,
Well, I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that people are working 2 or 3 jobs. I'm so sorry, I've got a frog in my throat.
all right, you clear it.
They're working 2 or 3 jobs and they still can't put food on the table. That is the problem. So I think we need to have an approach here that makes sure that people are paid properly if they
Cut their
are in
tax
work.
so they've got
They
more
should also, they can be paid first
Better
better
wages.
in the first place. And then we can make sure that there's investment in the NHS so that those people who can't work because they're on incredibly long waiting lists with the NHS might just have a chance of being able to get whatever the problem is cured, and then they can get back to work. But I think the approach that the government is taking, which is all about penalisation, is actually totally
There's a
counterproductive.
contradiction, I think, and I appreciate what you're saying, because Caroline, you referred earlier as well to, public spending. State spending has never been higher. I mean, it might be a completely thankless task for the
Compared to other
Conservatives.
countries, though, but
it's
compared
not.
to other
Yeah,
countries,
but
it isn't
at the
as
end of the
high.
day, public spending is higher, and even the Labour Party have been speaking. I recently read your manifesto for change in the NHS, that what you're saying is that some of these public services, which Caroline has identified, aren't working as they should, need reform, and that cost savings need to be made at some point across
But
government.
the
That doesn't
Conservatives have been in
necessarily mean
13
cuts.
years, haven't they?
If you look at the benefit system, particularly during the pandemic, I read this last week, that when it came to incapacity benefits claimants, as they were then known, during the pandemic, because the assessments went online, 100% of the claims got granted. Then that might need to be reassessed. I think most sane, rational people say to themselves, benefits should be
you
provided for people who cannot work, who are incapacitated either physically or mentally and are struggling. However, if there are some people that can be enticed back to doing some work, that's great. The only flaw in this argument, entitled to support, the only flaw in this argument is the government is saying that a lot of these people could work from home, when actually a lot of these people aren't in work from home professions. They're people that have worked in customer-facing roles. They've worked in supermarkets and they've worked for communities, and they're actually incapacitated. So they're not the kind of people.
Let Caroline respond, and I'll come to you, Angela. Go on, Caroline, respond.
Well, just on the issue of the NHS and whether or not it's about finances, some reform I'm sure could be appropriate, but the finance is the bottom line, because we know that the big problem is we don't have staff on our NHS anymore, because so many people are leaving the NHS demoralised, or because they can get better jobs in other countries or in other professions. So unless we pay people properly to do those jobs, we're going to be at a hiding to nothing. So we absolutely need to make sure that the NHS is properly
But that's
resourced.
then a high
and
tax, high spend approach.
Well, compared to other countries, we are not a high tax
But just
economy.
to clarify what that is high tax and it's high spend.
It
That's
depends
fine if
who's
that's your
paying the tax.
position.
I'm very happy for a wealth tax to be there. If you had a wealth tax,
All right, and you've said
taxing
that.
capital gains in the same way as we tax income from
neither
work.
of the parties is
it
suggesting
might
wealth tax.
actually.
Well, they should. Labour's supposed to be a party of Labour and
Yeah.
progressive.
It might actually be helpful if the money that was raised wasn't wasted. We've just seen the figures, about 25 billion a year being wasted since the last general election. That's £100 billion of money which could have been put to more productive use
But where we
than
are
it has
now,
been
Angela,
put to. So
what do you-
that's
yeah,
the
but hang on,
first
what do
thing.
you disagree with this? That those solely eligible for the standard universal credit allowance who refuse to engage with job centre staff or accept work offered to them after 6 months will have their claims closed. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I think we've seen that they should be being helped much sooner than 6 months. They shouldn't be
but that
being left
doesn't
for
that
6
sound
months.
reasonable?
It's a tiny minority of people.
Is it? So you know the figures. What sort of figures are we talking
It's a
about?
tiny minority of
what
people.
percentage?
Hang on, I'm asking the
Sorry,
questions.
Joe.
Can't get a word in edgeways. It's a tiny amount of the overall figures, people who refuse to engage. And often when you look at why they're refusing to engage, they've got mental health problems, they can't engage properly for all sorts of other reasons. You've got to help them, and threatening them with total destitution or saying we're going to stop giving you your free medicine is an outrage. What we should be doing is making sure that those people who are on NHS waiting lists, and there are 7.8 million people on an NHS waiting list, 2.8 million of them whom are of working age, get access to the treatment they need so they can get back to work.
I mean,
and that is what we should be doing, not threatening to take their medicine off them.
If it is a tiny number of people, you don't know what the figures are.
We'll find out.
And I don't know. Yes, we will find out. We'll find out tomorrow.
My surgery is full of people who've been shaken out of the labour market, often because they've got a condition, a mental health condition that comes and goes, that means they can't stay in the labour market properly. And sanctioning them so they can't afford to buy food isn't going to make them
let's take that point.
any
Is it
better.
going to work if you are dealing with an explosion in mental health conditions, many of them stemming from the pandemic? Mental health charities, including Mind, have warned sanctions won't work. They'll worsen people's mental health. Do you accept that?
Well, I don't think anybody is suggesting that somebody who's incapacitated, either physically or mentally, is going to be required to work. What they're saying is that if they refuse to engage, or they refuse the offer of work which has been given to them, presumably by an employer who thinks they're suitable for that job.
But sometimes people
there might be. Hold on.
Let him finish. Let him finish.
There might
Let him
be
finish.
consequences, but there is a well-developed system in Universal Credit now for assessing people's ability to work. And I have to say, it works both ways as well. So the DWP runs a very good scheme called Disability Confident, which is about training employers and supporting employers to employ those who have disabilities. And I have to tell you, I have a very big disability community in my constituency, and a lot of those people are desperate to work.
Right.
And
Well,
they just cannot find
I mean,
the
Caroline
places.
and Angela, but Caroline, first of all, do you accept that actually having a job, going to work, can sometimes help people's mental health?
Of course it can. Of course it can. But on the other side, it can also really harm people's mental health if you try and badger them and beat them and take away, as Angela said, things like
going on here?
Well, I think the idea of taking away free prescriptions must surely count as the most perverse, counterproductive, ridiculous, idiotic policy from a government that, frankly, has a record in doing all of those things.
Well, all right, but you suspect the
motive.
Well, you suspect the motivation. But let me just, Camilla, because you've written about this. You've written an op-ed recently. Just explain the idea of being able to tell the difference between someone who is a genuine claimant and others who perhaps are, to use a word, who don't want to work.
It's a tiny minority, but of course in every system we see people gaming it. You know, there are a couple of examples, but there are a couple of examples only in the last few months. You know, somebody who was claiming benefits, who said that she was bedbound, was seen going to theme parks on holiday.
Of course, but we also, for the numbers of people that do that, we've had people starved to death in Liverpool because they've been made destitute.
Angela, nobody's suggesting or advocating a system where people are starving.
But might that happen?
Having said that, we of course have to have a robust system to ensure that the people who are genuinely in need of state aid receive that help, and that those who could work do work. And if people, we've got 1 million vacancies and we've got 300,000 people, as far as I can understand from the reports I've read, that there are 300,000 people out there who are being offered work, and we have got 1 million vacancies and they're not taking it. It could be that they have got significant problems that they can't overcome, and in which case they need help, both professionally and medically, but also from the job centre. However, if there are people who are saying, actually, you know, I've weighed it up and I feel I'm better off on benefits than actually going out to work, even though it doesn't just help them, but also the local economy.
Nobody's better off on benefits than going out to work.
I think that has to be assessed.
Benefits have been cut.
Well, you haven't seen some of the case studies that have featured in the media then, Angela.
Benefits have been cut massively in the last 13 years. £2,700 a year taken off people who are in the bottom 20% of earners because of cuts, real-term cuts to benefits.
And on that,
just doesn't
well, let me
work.
put that together. On that, there's been a debate about which figure should be used for increasing benefits for next year. Labour have said that they will take the more generous September figure of 6.7%, the rate of inflation as it was in September, the usual figure. That is true. There's been some debate that the government would use October's figure of 4.6%. It looks as if that isn't going to be the case. No doubt that will be confirmed. Is that right?
I don't know.
No, but is that right, in principle, that they should go for the usual figure?
I think they should stick with the usual figure. Yeah.
Right,
I wouldn't want to see a diminution in the purchasing power of people on benefits. As I say, I mean, Camilla put it very well, but I do think there are always questions to be asked about those who are in receipt of welfare, about what their duty is to kind of try and get themselves off if they possibly can with support. But I wouldn't want to see the purchasing power diminishing.
Just the one other question. It says the report, and admittedly we're going to hear again tomorrow from Jeremy Hunt, that this new regime wouldn't start till 2025. Why would that be? Why not start it next year?
New regime on...
Well, the sort of sanctions that you would...
These things, having worked at DWP, I did 6 months as minister at DWP, I tell you that machine moves quite slowly. For all that universal credit is, has been a very successful system, it is a very large system now, and so you've got to move carefully to make sure that you don't have upsets, I would imagine.
OK, I mean...
Well, I did 5 years at the DWP, and I agree with Kit on this.
Right. But that may come if you win the election next year. Would you change those?
Well, we'll have to have a look and see what the system's like when we get there. We don't know how they're going to change it.
But you've just set out a very full-throated case for not supporting it, so I presume...
I have made quite clear that I think that it's ridiculous and just performative cruelty to threaten people with taking their medicines off them if they don't engage.
Performative cruelty. I mean, that is what the report says. It means they...
Perfectly reasonable request.
To take people's medicine off them.
No, it's perfectly reasonable to say that if you won't engage and you won't accept work that's been offered, and the DWP assesses, and don't forget they have a whole assessment system for your inability to work is, then there have to be questions asked about why you won't.
With that approach, that, yes, maybe there might be a minuscule number of people who are playing the system, but the price you pay for trying to stop them doing that is clamping down on a hell of a lot of people who actually are doing their very best but who need that support. And that's my worry. I would far rather, if we had to choose, to have a couple of people who are playing the system rather than having a system whereby it is all punitive, that it is taking away medicines and so on and so forth. But I do wish, if I could just say, that, you know, I know I've banged on about this twice already, about a wealth tax.
Not the wealth taxes.
But, well, I do, because
no, you can bang on about it, but neither party here is going to take on... You're huffing.
I think one of the quickest ways to destroy a capitalist economy, which is what we are, is to start...
Well, Switzerland doesn't seem to be doing too badly.
Caroline,
Spain doesn't seem to be doing too badly.
Caroline, you talked about taxing dividends. Well, we do tax dividends at the same level as we tax income at the moment already.
Stocks.
All right. We're going to move on and talk about protest. Let me show you this headline in The Eye. Hundreds of children join pro-Palestinian school strike protests across the UK. The group behind the protest School Strike for Palestine describes itself as a collective of local campaigners and parents. It prompted, if not directly, a tweet from the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan. I'm deeply concerned that some children are attending political protests during the school day, even more so if they're taking part in or being exposed to anti-Semitic chants. This should be treated with the utmost seriousness. Missing school for activism is unacceptable. That last sentence, is she right? Do you agree with her on that? Missing school for activism is unacceptable?
Well, I'm not sure I necessarily do, no. My view is that nobody should skip school without permission. And there's, you need to get permission from the school before you take a day off. But I don't think there's anything wrong in principle with young people getting involved politically. They do all sorts of other experience trips, so I don't think that's necessarily a problem. There is a question about what they're being exposed to when they go, but in principle... if you want to take your kids out, you get permission from the head teacher that that's acceptable to go and take part in some political... whatever it might be. I can't see that that's necessarily a problem. If it's persistent, and then I think there is a problem.
Well, we're looking at pictures of hundreds of children attending a pro-Palestinian demonstrations on Friday. Camilla, what's your view?
I think children would be better off in history lessons, actually learning about the history of this conflict and others. I think they'd be better off learning rather than from TikTok and extremist anti-Semites on there polluting the minds of younger people of what's actually going on and the seriousness of the anti-Semitism that we're seeing, not just on the streets of London, but actually in schools and educational establishments. To see young people tearing down the posters of kidnapped Israeli children has been one of the most depressing spectacles of recent times. To see young people dragged along to marches where, yes, some of the marches are peaceful, but others have been waving jihadi symbols, have been spouting anti-Semitic nonsense. I wouldn't have my children anywhere near it. And actually, if we've got a generation being educated by, frankly, completely ignorant malign influences on social media, then we have got to step up history in the national curriculum pronto.
Angela?
Well, I joined the Labour Party at 16. I used to go out of school in my lunch hour to go door knocking with various candidates. So far be it from me to worry about
younger children?
people getting involved in activism, so long as they've got their parental permission to do it. But I also agree with the point just made about teaching, I would say politics with a small p, and history, so that people can actually deal with the influences that are coming on social media, which are very malign and very dark in a lot of cases, so they can distinguish what's happening. I'd far rather see that than try to somehow tell a parent that they can't take their kid on a demonstration.
Where are you, Caroline? Because, of course, these aren't the only protests. We've seen lots of children take days off school to attend. We've seen school strikes for climate change organised by Greta Thunberg. We can see some pictures of those. Is there a value in children, in the way Angela has perhaps said, being engaged in political issues? Or is it the nature of the cause?
I mean, of course there's a value in young people being engaged in the issues all around them.
And missing school to do it?
Well, I mean, not on a systematic basis, but if it's from time to time, I don't think that's a bad thing, because hopefully what they're then going to bring back into the school is the opportunity to have those conversations, which they should be having in school, learning about some of the history of all of this. So I just think that tweet from Gillian Keegan was just so tendentious in so many ways. Thank you for bringing it back up there. So, you know, immediately you've got the juxtaposition between being on the marches and anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is an absolute evil and should be stamped out everywhere. But simply by taking part in some of these marches, I don't think that makes you automatically, as she seems to imply, anti-Semitic. So I think that we need to have a bit more respect for our young people, make sure that they're learning all that they need to learn in their history lessons, also actually in PSHE lessons where they can learn about the power of social media. And I was very anxious to ensure that PSHE does have a bigger role in our curriculum, and something that I've worked on. But I think that to say that young people shouldn't be out on some of these marches would be a very draconian position, particularly since they are learning about it all the time around.
So I agree, and I think Camilla's right in that if you take your kids on a march like that, and I agree with Angela, kids, you know, we complain, don't we, about a younger generation not being interested and involved in politics, but parents do have a duty to make sure that some of the negative things you might see on a demonstration, often the small groups that get the loudest voices, that doesn't translate into other parts of their lives. And as you know, we've seen reports, I think in the Telegraph today, about growing anti-Semitism in the playground.
Well, we can show that. You're referring to this headline, children saying they hate all Jews.
Yeah,
playground
we've
rouses,
seen,
anti-Semitism rises.
Just north of here in London, there was a school that had this awful graffiti in the bathroom, and parents who do that, and I think that's perfectly legitimate, do have a duty to make sure that their kids operate and then think within the realms of decency about, it's not just this issue, but on other
But there's been an inequality here
demonstrations.
with regard to schools and, Jewish hate, because we had a situation where we've still got a teacher up in Batley who can't work because of the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. We had the children and their parents sort of put before this bizarre spectacle because somebody dropped a Quran, and yet in other schools we've got open Jew hate in playgrounds.
Well,
that's completely unacceptable. But there's an imbalance there. There's an imbalance with the emphasis placed.
Unacceptable. We know that the Jewish community in the UK is far smaller. It's a very small community, and so they need proper protection, as do Jewish schools, from any kind of vandalism in what is a heartbreaking and difficult global situation that we're seeing playing out on our
Are you
TV
worried that
screens.
teachers, to pick up on your earlier point, Camilla, aren't equipped or perhaps reluctant to teach the conflict or history of the Middle East because we're hearing that it's too difficult and they'll be accused of bias?
I think that we don't teach history and modern history enough. We don't have. They have modern studies in Scotland, which is a much better way of dealing with politics, large P and small p, on the curriculum. We don't do it properly in England, and we're turning out people who don't if they don't read the newspapers of their own, out of their own interest, and that's a minority of people, they don't have the details, and they're getting their information from very partisan but seemingly neutral places that aren't partisan. They're actually...
Although you have to question whether it will be taught without bias in schools. Some of the behaviour that's been carried out on university campuses. I read a story last week about 500 alumni of UCL, of all places. UCL, that was the first university in England to admit Jews as students, complaining about grotesque anti-Semitism on campus. So we also have to ask ourselves, can we trust our educators to educate our children in a fair-minded manner rather than with bias?
Dangerous if you, I mean, whatever happened at UCL sounds terrible, but
it's not just at UCL.
But we're talking about right now. We're talking about secondary schools, and I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't trust teachers. I think too often, again and again, people try to second-guess teachers.
That's the trouble.
Well, but your implication is...
Some of them have been spouting anti-Semitism in lectures.
Can you just let me finish? I'm talking about secondary schools, and I'm talking about whether or not you said we can't trust teachers to teach history.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think you even said... But anyway, the point being that we have to trust teachers, and I agree with what Angela said. We need to be updating some of the curriculum in terms of what they are teaching.
Well, do we? Are they equipped to do? Because these are very difficult issues. There have been complaints on campuses about, again, the rise in anti-Semitism.
There's a more fundamental issue, which I have to say in my, whatever it is, 20-odd years now in politics I've seen develop, which is that we seem to have lost the ability to disagree well. Right, that whether it's social media or whatever, the demonisation of your opponents, whatever it might be, and we're seeing that particularly writ large now, right, the demonisation of the Jewish community and indeed the demonisation of the Muslim community in certain circumstances is really alarming, and the translation of that kind of binary thinking into our society is causing this horrible tension.
Do politicians have a responsibility?
Sorry?
Do politicians have a responsibility?
We do, and I think
do you think the behaviour of the Home Secretary, the former Home Secretary, helped or hindered that?
No, I don't. I don't think it helped at all. And I think we all have to use measured language, and we have to learn to disagree. Well, I disagree profoundly about the way the country should be run with Angela, but I don't think she's evil. I think she's just misguided.
Angela, would you like...
The dialogue will be...
I mean, in all seriousness, right? And I think we do get ourselves trapped in this thing where our opponents are evil and wicked and to be despised and hated.
Bigots.
And that's why people show up outside your office and abuse you in graffiti, or they show up at Conservative Party conference calling us scum.
Just to ask
right?
Caroline,
because
though, do you think it's a comfortable
position
position for a young person today, with social media being as it is, and what we've heard about campuses, to express on a campus or indeed in a secondary school, you know, pro-Israel views, right-wing views? Goodness me, Caroline, maybe even a degree of climate scepticism. Do you think that their views are welcomed and that they're discussed in an open and robust fashion? Or are they actually pointed at, called bigots and told to shut up?
Let Caroline answer.
I think that was an interesting set of things you juxtaposed there, and I don't quite know why denying climate science is somehow put into the same category as anti-Semitism.
I'm not correlating them, I'm just giving them as examples of alternative narratives in left-leaning establishments of education.
Would you want people to be saying that the earth is flat in those circumstances?
But I would want children to be able to express themselves
let's separate out
counter to the narrative on social media. I would really love them to be able to be free to express themselves.
Well, there
is such an assumption, as what you're saying there, as if all of social media was somehow a nice woke Guardian literati, and it's not.
That the teaching establishment doesn't have biases, and it does, I'm afraid.
But it could have biases either way.
Exactly.
Angela?
Exactly.
Well, yes, I think that this dividing and ruling and the use of woke as some kind of sort of nasty term that the government has indulged in is causing part of this trouble as well. And I think particularly of trans people and the way that they're problematised, the way that immigrants and asylum seekers are problematised. You see it everywhere. It's exacerbated by what happens on social media. And so what we have to do, as someone who was one of the few pro-Labour people in my school and once walked into the sixth form to see it plastered in Tory posters just so that people could watch what my response would be when I walked in. I understand what Camilla's saying, but it's not always left bias, or it's not always one way. So let's just, whether I'm misguided or not, agree that we have to have spaces where we can talk about things without regarding each other as monsters.
Well, let's continue in that vein of vague collaboration. The Guardian's headline, World Facing Hellish. 3 degrees Celsius of climate heating, UN warns before COP28 conference. We must start setting records on cutting emissions, says the UN boss, because you'll see that temperature records obliterated in 2023. We can show you the graph, I think, and you can see that huge spike in October, hottest on record. Global average October temperature by year compared, as you can see, far lower temperatures for October in the years before 1850 to 1900. The conference starts next week in UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and the report today says that carbon cutting policies are so inadequate that 3 degrees Celsius of heating would be reached this century. Are the Greens still committed, and do you think it's achievable to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius?
We're still committed to doing our very damnedest to stay below 1.5 degrees. I think it's going to be very difficult, but I don't think that's an argument for saying let's not try, because every single fraction of a degree matters, every single tonne of carbon dioxide matters. So we need to be redoubling every effort rather than thinking that because we don't perhaps look as we're going to meet this target, we should somehow give up. But I think what we should be taking away from this is the responsibility, particularly in the wealthiest countries, to be doing more. And if I can put a challenge to Kit, as he won't be surprised, I just feel that at this time, for a government to be giving the green light to 100 new oil and gas licences in the North Sea, to be giving the green light to the Rosebank oil field, which is going to be the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. The vast majority of the oil is going to be for export, so it's going to do absolutely nothing for our energy security. It won't bring down our energy bills. What it will do is drive the climate emergency still more. And so I really do worry about that. And before Kit comes back and says, as I'm sure he will, that we've done more than any other country to reduce our emissions. Well, actually, A, since 2015, we haven't. Germany has. B, if you look at our so-called consumption emissions, which basically means the emissions that we are consuming because we're importing products from other countries where we've outsourced our manufacturing, add all of that in, the reduction is much closer to about 20% of a cut since 1990. So the bottom line is the UK isn't doing enough. We need to do more, and we've got a government that, instead of taking the right action, is actually setting the planet more on fire, basically through giving the green light to more and more oil and gas.
Let's leave what has happened up until now, because I think that's well documented in terms of the UK's progress. But what about from now on in?
So, look, I mean, I wanted to make an economic argument about this issue. So I agree that we're not perfect and there's lots more that can be done. But one of the interesting things the report says is that actually it's the larger nations that now need to make a bigger change. And the only way we're going to persuade China and those
US,
countries,
India,
the US, to change is if they have better technology. I have a strong belief that the solution to this problem for humanity, as with all other solutions, will lie in the combination of science and capitalism.
Right. Is that a bit of crossing your fingers?
And look, we as a country have been brilliant at inventing things and then selling it to the rest of the world. We invented the hydrogen fuel cell here. It was a Welshman invented it. We now could be getting the whole world to switch across to a hydrogen economy.
But there isn't
save huge amount.
urgency here.
Please, can I finish? Which would save huge amounts of carbon emissions. The key to that, though, is a really vigorous, pullulating, risk-taking capitalist economy. And if we don't have that, if we think that government is the solution, we're going to struggle.
Well, this government
is it the solution?
isn't the solution, I can tell you that.
Is
But I can
government the
tell you-
solution? Does it have to be
handing out
government-led, this? Does it have to be legislation and action taken that will actually perhaps mean that 1.5...
The government needs to put in place the kind of policy framework to give the private investors the confidence to invest. Well,
Yes,
it is,
cut
for
tax.
example...
Change the risk-reward.
You just
get people to
criticise
invest.
me for interrupting you. Maybe you could just me speak. I think there is a role, of course, for government to set that framework so that then investors know that it is safe to invest, private investors. But what we've had from Rishi Sunak is somebody who's just torn up what was a consensus around the need to act on climate change. He's been rolling back what we thought was going to be the case for electric vehicles, for example. So private investors are tearing their hair out, and you can look at quotes from people like Aviva and so forth who are really, really worried about this. So the private sector is confused, and the government is going down exactly the wrong route.
Would you
the
accept
idea
that? Would you accept that the delay in the ban on diesel petrol cars from 2030, delaying it to 2035, continuing with the oil and gas licences, although part that to one side, but on cars itself, on vehicles and the emissions, that was a retrograde step? It has led to investor confidence sliding.
No, I think it was a difficult decision because the Prime Minister has to balance two things, right? He has to balance exactly that.
Politics.
Hold on. He has to balance the confidence of the industry to invest and all the rest of it. But he also has to balance it against the impact on real people and their lives. And the idea we could get to something that's only, 18 months away and have this massive change was just not realistic. And so having a short extension, notwithstanding the fact that most of the OEMs are still investing in well, I think it's not the right technology batteries. I'd much rather we were building hydrogen cars. But, that may come in time. So,
right.
As I say, but the key thing is that, you have to balance consumer impact and demand
with the effect on
against the
that may be because there needs to be a well, hang on. Let me come to Angela. Angela, is Labour still committed to that 1.5 degrees Celsius target?
Well, we've got, as a community, as a global community, to get there. 2% is barely livable, 3% is impossible for humanity.
So are you're committed to that?
And every single signature to the Paris Agreement is failing on what they undertook to do. In order to get to the stage where we can hope to stay under 2%, we've got to have a 29% cut globally.
Right. Would it help if you'd criticise the government on the oil and gas licences because you've agreed that they should go ahead until and if you win power next year?
But we've got our Green Deal where we're going to be investing large amounts of money in transforming our
that doesn't
infrastructure.
stop the fossil fuels, though, Angela.
No,
there's some nice good stuff coming over here, but if you're not stopping doing the bad stuff, the emissions still keep going
I
up.
understand that that's your that's
science.
I understand that is your view.
No, but it's science.
We
It's
have
the
to
fossil
have a look
fuels.
to see where we are with the contracts that have been signed. What you don't want to have to do is pay vast amounts of money to rip up contracts that have already signed, which you might be able to spend on transforming the national grid,
right?
Or having a battery plant so you can have more electric cars, or having a subsidy for new electric cars.
Would anything that you're suggesting, your £28 billion green policies investment, as you have confirmed, is going to be delayed to some extent because you haven't seen the figures? Because you haven't seen the figures, and you want to.
You can't spend 28 billion from a standing start per
year.
year.
But you haven't said you revoke the oil and gas licence. Is there anything that Labour will do going into that election that will make a difference to reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius?
Well, I think that what we're doing here is precisely enabling that.
All right.
And seriously. And also renewing and revitalising our local manufacturing industry, creating massive numbers of green jobs. It's a win-win. You get away from stranded assets, which are the old technologies.
Fossil fuels
all right, let me bring
this is just talk.
Let me bring Camilla in, because this is the Guardian headline on this issue: the massive environmental impact of the richest 10% worldwide, ignoring effect of the middle classes, which is very broad in the terms that they use, could make ending the climate crisis impossible. How far are you prepared to go individually, as a family, to actually make a bigger contribution than you do now?
Quite far, because I really think it's important, but at the same time you've got to take people with you. So this kind of form of, if you would take more people with you, the Greens would have more seats in Parliament. This form of, well, it might be first past the post, but also, OK, let's use another example. Let's use another example. People aren't necessarily in their droves behind this sort of green extremism of Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, because
no one's talking about that.
I'm
talking about keeping fossil fuels.
I'm talking about it, Caroline, and I'm saying that people want to do their best in this country. I think people largely do try to do their best. They try to do their best by cutting waste, by recycling. They want to transfer onto
cars and flights.
Yeah, they
boilers.
want to transfer onto
you need
electric cars.
You need government.
But at the same time, some of this sort of what I would call, we talked about children and anxiety earlier, some of the methods that are employed by the Greens and other campaign groups are just, frightening and solution-free.
I'm going to let them carry on, but that's all we've got time for today. I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15. Bye.
just trying to remember. Is it tomorrow, the autumn statement? Literally can't remember. Might be. Never know. Wednesday. PMQs. Bit late this stream. Can't be asked, to be fair. Anyway, see you all tomorrow, 11:15. Yeah. If I'm awake. You'll get me at 11:15, if not, whatever. So no. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day, night, whatever time you fucking happen to live on this crazy ass thing we call a rock. Ta-da.